Walk into almost any reptile expo or pet store in the US, and you'll see the same handful of showpiece reptiles pulling in every beginner. The bright green iguana in the big display tank, the color-shifting chameleon perched on a branch, the massive python coiled up behind glass. These are the animals that go viral, the ones people fall in love with after one Instagram reel. And they're also, in a huge number of cases, some of the worst possible first reptiles someone could buy. The problem isn't that these animals are bad pets. It's that most of them were never designed, biologically speaking, to live comfortably in a beginner's first enclosure. Some outgrow every tank a normal household can fit. Some need humidity and misting schedules precise enough to rival a lab environment. Some get big enough and strong enough to genuinely injure an inexperienced handler. So in this video, we're covering 10 popular reptiles, why each one is a rough choice for most beginners, and the alternative that gives you a similar look or experience without the same level of risk, cost, or heartbreak. Let's get into it. 1. Green iguana versus bearded dragon. The green iguana is one of the most iconic reptiles in the American pet trade, and it's easy to understand the appeal. That bold green color, the spiky dorsal crest, the sheer prehistoric presence of the animal. Baby iguanas are also sold cheap, sometimes for less than $50, which makes them look like a low-commitment purchase. They are the opposite of low commitment. A healthy adult green iguana can reach 5 to 6 feet in total length, including its whip-like tail, which it will use defensively, and that tail can genuinely bruise or cut an unprepared owner. Their enclosure needs scale with them, meaning most serious iguana keepers eventually convert an entire room or build a custom multi-level enclosure, since a standard glass tank stops being viable within the first year or two. Iguanas are also strict herbivores with precise calcium and UVB requirements, and getting that wrong leads to metabolic bone disease, one of the most common and most preventable health crises in captive iguanas. On top of all that, mature iguanas, especially males, often become noticeably more aggressive during breeding season, sometimes lunging, tail whipping, or biting even a familiar owner. The bearded dragon solves almost every one of these problems while still giving you a bold, personality-driven lizard. Adults max out around 18 to 24 inches, meaning a 40 to 75 gallon enclosure is genuinely sufficient for life, no room conversion required. They're naturally docile, tolerate handling well, and are famous for their calm, almost dog-like demeanor. They'll wave at you, bask contentedly, and rarely show the defensive aggression an iguana can. Their diet is omnivorous and far more forgiving, and UVB and calcium needs, while still important, are much easier to manage consistently. You get a striking, interactive lizard that actually fits in a beginner's home, instead of one that eventually needs its own room. 2. Chameleon versus crested gecko chameleons are arguably the most visually mesmerizing reptiles sold in pet stores, and the ability to shift color, combined with those independently rotating eyes, makes them look almost otherworldly. Unfortunately, chameleons are also widely considered one of the hardest reptile groups to keep successfully, and a large percentage of chameleons bought by first-time owners die within their first year. The core issue is how narrow their comfort zone is. Chameleons need a very specific humidity gradient maintained through misting systems or automatic drippers, often multiple times a day, alongside a well-ventilated screen enclosure that still holds enough humidity to prevent dehydration, a genuinely tricky balance to hit consistently. They're also extremely sensitive to stress, and unlike a lot of reptiles, chameleons generally do not want to be handled. Frequent handling alone can trigger stress-related illness. They're solitary and territorial, to the point that even seeing their own reflection in glass can cause chronic stress, which is part of why chameleons are typically kept in mesh enclosures rather than standard tanks. The crested gecko gives you a similarly striking, arboreal reptile without that razor-thin margin for error. They don't strictly require UVB lighting to thrive, though many keepers now provide it as a best practice, and their humidity needs, while real, are far more forgiving than a chameleon's precise misting schedule. Crested geckos also tolerate gentle handling reasonably well once acclimated, and their diet can be as simple as a commercial powdered meal replacement mixed with water. No live insect gut loading required, though offering some insects is a nice bonus. With their crown of soft spikes and wide range of colors and patterns, crested geckos deliver a genuinely exotic-looking arboreal pet that a beginner can actually keep alive and thriving. 3. Frilled dragon versus bearded dragon. The frilled dragon owes its fame almost entirely to one image, that dramatic neck frill flaring open like a prehistoric umbrella. It's a genuinely striking display, and it's made the frilled dragon a bucket list reptile for a lot of first-time buyers who see it at an expo. The problem is that the frill display is basically the highlight reel, and the day-to-day reality of keeping this species is considerably harder than it looks. Frilled dragons are skittish by nature, far more prone to stress than their bearded cousins, and that stress commonly shows up as glass surfing, repeatedly pacing and scratching at the enclosure walls, which can cause snout injuries over time. They're also strictly arboreal, meaning they need a tall enclosure with substantial vertical climbing space rather than the wider ground-level setup that works for many beginner lizards, and that vertical space is harder to source and heat evenly. Because they're more delicate and easily stressed, frilled dragons generally don't tolerate handling the way a beginner might expect from watching online videos, and frequent handling can actually work against taming them. Once again, the bearded dragon is the more realistic choice here. It offers plenty of visual drama of its own, puffing out its beard and even changing to a darker shade when stressed or displaying, without the same fragility. Its enclosure can be simpler and more ground-oriented, its temperament is dramatically calmer and more handling tolerant, and its husbandry has been refined by decades of captive breeding to the point that reliable, beginner-friendly care information is everywhere. 4. Savannah monitor versus blue-tongued skink. Savannah monitors get marketed as an accessible entry point into monitor lizards, since they're smaller than some of their giant cousins and sold cheaply as hatchlings. But smaller than a Komodo dragon still means a genuinely large, powerful, high-maintenance reptile, and Savannah monitors have one of the worst reputations in the hobby for ending up neglected, obese, or surrendered. Adult Savannah monitors typically reach 3 to 4 feet, with a heavy, muscular build and powerful claws built for digging, and they need very high basking temperatures, often well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, alongside a deep substrate layer for burrowing, all inside an enclosure that generally needs to be custom built to properly house an adult. One of the most common problems in captivity is obesity, since Savannah monitors have voracious appetites, and owners frequently overfeed them relative to their actual activity level, leading to serious health issues and shortened lifespans. They're also intelligent enough to become genuinely responsive to consistent handling. The blue-tongued skink offers a far more manageable version of that large, intelligent lizard experience. Adults generally stay in the 18 to 24-inch range, which allows for a realistic, non-custom enclosure, and their temperament is famously docile once settled in. Many individuals become genuinely calm, food-motivated, and tolerant of regular handling. They're omnivorous with a broad, forgiving diet, ground-dwelling rather than needing elaborate climbing structures, and their heat and UVB requirements, while still important, don't demand the extreme basking temperatures a Savannah monitor needs. You still get a chunky, characterful lizard with real presence, just one whose care needs match what an average household can actually provide. 5. Tokay gecko versus leopard gecko. The tokay gecko is one of the most strikingly colored geckos sold in the US, with vivid blue-gray skin covered in orange spots, and its loud, distinctive call has made it something of an internet novelty. What a lot of first-time buyers don't realize is that tokay geckos have a reputation well-earned as one of the least handleable geckos in the entire trade. Tokay geckos are notoriously defensive and quick to bite, and unlike a nervous nip from a smaller gecko, a tokay's bite is strong enough to draw blood, and, in some cases, genuinely hard to get them to release. Most experienced keepers treat tokays as display-only animals rather than pets you interact with directly, which is a very different experience than what most beginners expect when they picture getting a pet gecko. They're also nocturnal, arboreal, and require consistently high humidity, meaning their enclosure setup is more involved than a simple terrestrial tank, and they tend to stay hidden for large parts of the day, limiting the amount of actual observable activity a beginner gets to enjoy. The leopard gecko remains one of the best beginner reptiles for a reason. It's naturally calm, tolerates gentle handling well once acclimated, and doesn't carry anywhere near the bite risk or defensiveness of a tokay. Its terrestrial setup is straightforward, a simple tank with a warm and cool side, some hides, and a shallow water dish. And while supplemental UVB is now recommended as best practice, its overall husbandry has been refined through decades of captive breeding into one of the most beginner-proof reptile care routines available. With dozens of color and pattern morphs to choose from, leopard geckos still give you plenty of visual variety, just wrapped in a temperament a first-time owner can actually enjoy interacting with. 6. Chinese water dragon versus bearded dragon. The Chinese water dragon is a genuinely beautiful animal, bright green with a crested spine and a long, elegant tail, often photographed perched dramatically over water. That water feature is part of the appeal and part of the problem, because water dragons need a semi-aquatic setup that's considerably more involved to build and maintain than a standard terrestrial reptile tank. A proper water dragon enclosure needs to be tall, since they're semi-arboreal, while also including a substantial water basin deep enough for full submersion and swimming, which most beginner-sized tanks simply can't provide without serious custom modification. That water feature also needs strong filtration and frequent cleaning, since water dragons often defecate in water, and dirty water quickly becomes a health hazard. On top of the enclosure complexity, water dragons are notably skittish, especially as juveniles, and are prone to glass surfing and snout rubbing injuries from repeatedly bolting into the enclosure walls when startled, an issue that shows up far more often with this species than with calmer beginner lizards. The bearded dragon shows up again here for good reason. It delivers a similarly sized, visually engaging lizard without the semi-aquatic enclosure complexity or the skittish temperament. Its arid setup is simpler to build and maintain. It settles into handling far more readily, and it doesn't carry the same glass surfing and snout injury risk that comes with a more nervous semi-aquatic species. 7. Nile monitor versus Ackie monitor. The Nile monitor is sometimes sold to beginners specifically because it's large and impressive looking as a hatchling, an animal that already hints at serious size potential. That size potential is exactly the problem. Nile monitors are among the largest monitor species commonly available in the pet trade, with adults regularly reaching 5 to 7 feet in length, and they're powerful enough that housing and handling one safely requires real experience most first-time keepers simply don't have yet. An adult Nile monitor generally needs a custom-built enclosure on the scale of an entire room, since standard commercial tanks and even most large reptile cages fall far short of what the species needs to move and thermoregulate properly. They're also known for being food aggressive, and without extensive consistent handling from a young age, tend to remain defensive and difficult to safely manage as adults, with a bite and tail whip strong enough to genuinely injure an owner. Perhaps most seriously, released or escaped pet Nile monitors have established real invasive populations in parts of Florida where they prey on native wildlife, including the eggs of endangered species, making irresponsible ownership an ecological issue, not just a personal one. If monitor lizards are specifically what draws you in, the Ackie monitor, also called the spiny-tailed monitor, is a dramatically more realistic option, though it's worth verifying its suitability against your specific experience level before committing, since monitors as a group still demand more from a keeper than most beginner lizards. Ackies stay in the 2 to 2.5 foot range as adults, which allows for a large but genuinely achievable enclosure, roughly 6 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet, rather than a custom room build. They're highly active and intelligent, and with regular patient handling from a young age, many Ackies become noticeably tame and interactive. You'll still need to provide monitor-level heat and UVB, and a deep substrate for their natural digging behavior, but you get the intelligence and presence of a monitor lizard in a size an experienced hobbyist can genuinely manage at home. 8. Burmese python versus children's python, or Kenyan sand boa. The Burmese python is sold small, patterned, and calm, which makes it an easy impulse buy for someone drawn to snakes, but unaware of what large constrictor actually means in practice. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species commonly kept as pets, with captive adults regularly reaching well over 10 feet, and some individuals pushing past 15 or even 18 feet under ideal conditions. Housing an adult Burmese python properly requires an enclosure most owners end up building themselves, since commercially available cages rarely accommodate a snake of that length comfortably, and feeding shifts from small mice to large rabbits or similar prey items as the snake matures. Beyond the size and feeding logistics, handling a large constrictor safely requires real experience, and, for bigger specimens, generally more than one person, since safety incidents involving oversized pet constrictors, while relatively rare, do happen and are taken seriously by the reptile community. Burmese pythons also live decades, meaning this is a multi-decade commitment made at the size of a coat sleeve. Perhaps most significantly, released or escaped Burmese pythons have established a large, well-documented invasive population in the Florida Everglades. For keepers who want the look and feel of a pet snake without the eventual size crisis, children's pythons and Kenyan sand boas are both excellent alternatives, and which one fits better really depends on your audience and what kind of handling experience you're after. Children's pythons stay in a manageable 3 to 4 foot range as adults, have a calm, generally food-motivated temperament, and can be housed comfortably in a standard-sized enclosure for their entire lives. Kenyan sand boas go even smaller, topping out around 2 feet, and are a burrowing, low-key species that spends much of its time under substrate, making it an especially low-maintenance option for someone who wants a snake without a demanding activity or handling schedule. Either choice lets you keep a genuinely easy, long-term pet snake without ever facing the "what do I do with a 15-foot python" problem. 9. Red-eared slider versus musk turtle. The red-eared slider is sold constantly as a starter turtle, often as a tiny, coin-sized hatchling in a small tank, which makes it look like a low-commitment pet. Almost nothing about that first impression holds up over time. Red-eared sliders are one of the most commonly surrendered and, unfortunately, most commonly released pets in the entire reptile trade, largely because owners don't anticipate how large and demanding they become. A healthy adult red-eared slider typically grows a shell of 10 to 12 inches, and properly housing one long-term generally means a 75-gallon aquarium or larger, or an outdoor pond in suitable climates, dramatically bigger than the small tank most hatchlings start in. They're also messy, heavy waste producers, requiring powerful filtration and frequent water changes to keep ammonia in check, on top of strong UVB and basking setups to prevent shell and metabolic issues. Their lifespan is another major factor that catches owners off guard. Healthy red-eared sliders can live 20 to 40 years, which is a genuinely long commitment for an animal bought on impulse. Musk turtles, sometimes called stink pots, are a smaller, more manageable option worth considering, though it's worth verifying they match your specific care goals, since some keepers may still prefer a semi-aquatic species over sliders for other reasons. Musk turtles generally stay around 4 to 5 inches, meaning a 20 to 30-gallon tank can genuinely house one for life, a far smaller footprint than a slider eventually needs. Their waste output and filtration demands scale down accordingly, and while they still need proper UVB, basking, and water quality care, the overall setup is considerably easier to maintain long-term in a standard home aquarium rather than requiring a room-sized tank or backyard pond.